I was reviewing shipment variance reports when my phone started vibrating against the edge of my desk. Tuesday, 3:17 p.m., San Diego, quarter-end week. I almost ignored it. The subject line on my screen read cold chain delay, Singapore hub. My brain was already calculating fixes. But then I saw the caller ID, Mom. I tapped speakerphone without looking away from the monitor. Hey, Mom, I'm in the middle of… Elena, honey. Her voice arrived soft, almost rehearsed, too calm. Do you have a minute? That was the first sign. I can listen, I said, still typing. There was a pause. Not an awkward one, a deliberate one, like someone stepping onto a stage and waiting for the lights. Well, she sighed lightly, there's been a little issue with the wedding. I stopped typing. What kind of issue? Another pause. Then the words came out smoothly, like they'd been practiced in advance. Your father and I just realized we accidentally forgot to book your plane ticket to Maui. The word accidentally hovered in the air between us. I leaned back in my chair. The office hummed around me, printers, keyboards, quiet conversations, but my cubicle felt suddenly soundproof. You forgot my flight, I repeated. And the hotel, she added quickly, filling the silence. That too. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the spreadsheet in front of me, 47 columns wide, every number balanced because I had balanced it. That was my job, fixing things, making sure nothing fell through the cracks. Funny how often people assumed I'd be fine if I did. It's peak season, my mother continued, a little too fast. Everything is booked. We checked. There's just nothing available. In the background, I heard my father's voice, muffled but clear enough. Tell her it's impossible, he said. Tell her we tried. They weren't comforting each other. They were coordinating. I closed my eyes. Did you check the confirmation code? I asked. The what, sweetheart? The group booking code Madison sent in January, I said calmly. The one I forwarded to you. The one that held my seat and room. Oh, my mom said. That must have gotten lost. We've had so much going on. Lost. Like my birthday 2 months ago, when they scheduled a wine tour the same weekend and told me not to be sensitive. Like the Thanksgiving I skipped because they forgot to tell me the time had changed. Like the countless moments I'd learned to swallow because making noise only made things worse. I knew then, with absolute clarity, that this wasn't a mistake. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been removed. So that's it, I said. I'm just not going. Well, there's nothing we can do now, my mom replied, relief seeping into her voice. Madison will be disappointed, of course. I almost laughed. I'm sure she will. We'll make it up to you, she said. We'll all go to dinner when we get back, somewhere nice. I looked at my screen again. At the Singapore issue. I already knew how to fix it. Reroute through Dubai. Temperature-controlled storage. Problem solved. This wasn't like that. This wasn't a problem. It was a choice. I have to go, I said. The report's due. Oh, okay. We love you, Elena. I ended the call without saying it back. For a long moment, I just sat there. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone reheated fish in the break room. Life moved on as if nothing had happened. I was good at my job. I paid my bills. I handled crises without panicking. And my own family had erased me from the most important event of their year like it was a minor scheduling edit. My hand drifted from the mouse to the keyboard. I minimized the logistics dashboard and opened a folder hidden behind a generic file name. I had created it after the forgotten birthday. I'd called it Life Contingency. Inside was a document I knew by heart. Savings accounts, exit timelines, lease penalties. A clean, unemotional roadmap for disappearing without drama. At the top of the page, a single question stared back at me. If you're forgotten often enough, do you eventually learn how to remember yourself? My phone buzzed again. A text from Madison. Mom said she told you. Why are you making this a big deal? I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my company's HR portal and pulled up the sabbatical request form. 12 months. Reason, personal development. I hit submit. My office phone rang almost immediately. My manager's voice was sharp with panic. Elena, what is this? You can't take a year. This department runs on you. I smiled faintly. I know, I said. That's the problem. When I hung up, something inside me felt lighter. Not relieved, not happy, clear. That evening, when the office emptied and the sun dipped low over the San Diego skyline, I packed my bag and shut down my computer. As I stood up, I glanced once more at that folder on my screen. The contingency plan wasn't an escape. It was a door, and for the first time in my life, I was finally ready to walk through it. I submitted the paperwork the same night I packed my first box. Not because I was angry, and not because I wanted to prove a point, but because something inside me had gone quiet in a way that felt permanent. When that happens, you either listen or you spend years pretending you didn't hear it. 12 months. Unpaid. Clean exit. HR called the next morning, confused and alarmed. My manager tried persuasion first, then guilt. He talked about projects only I understood, systems that depended on my memory, clients who trusted my name. I listened patiently, thanked him for the confidence, and said no. For the first time, I did not explain myself. I simply repeated the decision until silence filled the line. That weekend, my apartment turned into a sorting ground for a life I had been maintaining rather than living. Furniture went to donation centers. Clothes were boxed and labeled, then reduced by half. The framed photos came down last. I noticed that most of them were family events I had organized, but barely remembered enjoying. I canceled my lease. I arranged long-term storage for my car. I sold what made sense to sell and let go of the rest. Each task felt oddly procedural, like shutting down a system the right way so it would not crash later. The only message I sent my family was a single line in the group chat. I won't be at the wedding. I'll be offline for a while. No explanation, no apology. My phone lit up almost immediately. Madison called first. I let it ring. Then came the texts. "What is wrong with you? You're being dramatic. Do you have any idea what this does to me?" There was no, "Are you okay?" and no, "Where are you going?" Just anger, sharp and offended, as if my absence were an inconvenience rather than a loss. When I finally read her last message, I felt something settle into place. "You always do this. You make everything about you." I stared at the screen, then placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter. That sentence clarified more than any argument ever could. My feelings were not excessive. They were simply irrelevant. I left San Diego 2 days later. Not for Hawaii. Not for anywhere symbolic. I booked a one-way flight to Portland because it was quiet, familiar enough to be grounding, and temporary by design. I stayed with an old college friend who asked no questions and made no assumptions. We drank coffee on her back porch in the mornings, watched the rain slide down the glass, and spoke about everything except family. After a week, I booked the next flight. Lisbon was not an escape. It was a calculation, lower cost of living, strong logistics networks, access to emerging small manufacturers, time zones that forced me to slow down. I rented a narrow apartment with white walls and one window that looked onto a street where locals argued gently over bread in the mornings. I set a strict budget and tracked every expense, not out of fear, but out of respect for the choice I had made. Freedom deserved structure, or it would collapse under its own weight. I enrolled in a short program on cross-border operations for small and mid-sized businesses. The classroom was a mix of languages and accents, and for the first time in years, no one knew who I was supposed to be. That anonymity felt like oxygen. During the course, I volunteered to help a small medical equipment workshop outside the city. They could not pay me. I told them that was fine. Their supply chain was a mess, not because of incompetence, but because no one had ever taken the time to see the whole picture. Parts arrived late. Documentation was duplicated. Communication broke down between people who wanted the same outcome, but spoke different operational languages. I listened before I suggested anything. I sat with the owner as he explained his constraints, then with the floor manager who showed me where the bottlenecks lived in real time, not on paper. I realized that what I did best was not optimizing numbers, but translating intention into systems that respected human reality. One afternoon, the owner watched as I sketched a revised flow on a whiteboard. "You don't act like a consultant," he said carefully. "What do I act like?" I asked. "Like someone who plans for people, not just processes." That stayed with me. At night, I walked the city alone. The sound of trams echoed through narrow streets. The air smelled like salt and roasted coffee. I ate simply, slept deeply, and felt my nervous system recalibrate in ways I had not known it needed. I did not miss my family. That realization startled me at first, then steadied me. I was not disappearing. I was recentering. And somewhere between the spreadsheets, the quiet mornings, and the unfamiliar language drifting through open windows, I understood that I had crossed a line I could not uncross. I was no longer waiting to be remembered. The work stopped being small the moment people stopped asking where I had come from and started asking when I was available. It began quietly, with referrals passed hand to hand instead of announced. A distributor in Warsaw called after hearing about a workshop in Portugal that had stabilized its delivery cycles without layoffs. Then another, then a manufacturer outside Łódź that had lost contracts because its timelines looked unreliable on paper, even when its products were excellent. I did not pitch myself as a savior or a disruptor. I listened, asked questions that slowed the room, and rebuilt processes from the inside out so they could survive scrutiny without losing their humanity. My rule was simple and non-negotiable. I did not force a system onto people who would have to live with it. I translated. I took local realities, labor rhythms, and cultural constraints, then aligned them with international standards that buyers demanded. When something did not work, I owned it and revised without blame. Results followed, not dramatically at first, but steadily enough to be trusted. That trust changed everything. By the time I incorporated my consulting practice, I was no longer chasing work. I was choosing it. I named the company plainly, my last name, and the word operations, because I was done hiding behind grand ideas. Precision had always been my strength. I leaned into it. That was when the past noticed me. A former colleague sent a message that contained no greeting and no context. It was a link to a public-facing project summary I had posted, stripped of proprietary details but clear in its architecture. He wrote one sentence beneath it. "Careful, Victor's watching." Victor Hale had been my strategic director at the old firm. He had never been openly cruel, which made him dangerous in a way people often underestimated. He smiled while redirecting credit. He praised teamwork while submitting decks with his name alone on the title slide. When I left, he told me it was a shame I lacked the patience for leadership. Now he was following my work. At first, I did nothing. I watched instead. I noticed how his company began offering services that mirrored my language without understanding the load-bearing parts. They copied outputs but skipped the diagnostics. They advertised speed without building resilience. They made promises their suppliers could not realistically keep. He reached out a month later. "Elena," he said warmly over video, as if we had parted on equal footing. "I've been impressed by your recent projects. You always had a good head for systems." I smiled back, matching his tone exactly. "That's kind of you to say." "We're expanding into Eastern Europe," he continued. "I thought perhaps there might be opportunities to collaborate." I considered the offer carefully before responding. "I'm already fully booked," I said, "but I'm happy to share high-level insights if it helps." He leaned forward, interest sharpening. That would be generous. Generosity, I had learned, could be strategic. I shared data that was accurate in isolation and misleading in application. Performance metrics without context. Vendor profiles that looked impeccable but hid volatility in governance. I watched as his team moved quickly toward partnerships that appeared efficient on paper and fragile in reality. At the same time, I moved quietly. A Texas-based medical distribution group called Silvercore approached me after one of their pilot regions outperformed projections. They did not want speed, they wanted durability. I negotiated flexible exclusivity agreements with manufacturers who valued stability over headlines. Nothing flashy. Nothing binding enough to raise alarms. Just enough alignment to make imitation impossible. The pressure built slowly, then all at once. Victor called again, irritation barely concealed beneath politeness. "Some of these suppliers aren't delivering as expected," he said. "Your framework suggested otherwise." "My framework depends on conditions," I replied evenly. Perhaps those conditions weren't fully in place. Silence stretched between us. "You always did enjoy ambiguity," he said at last. "I enjoy clarity," I corrected. "Ambiguity happens when people skip steps." When the call ended, I sat back and exhaled. My hands were steady. My pulse was not elevated. This was not revenge. This was alignment. I had designed systems that revealed truth under pressure, and truth was doing what it always does when rushed. I closed my laptop and looked out the window at the gray Warsaw sky. Snow was beginning to fall, slow and deliberate. For the first time, I understood that the power I was building did not come from outmaneuvering one man, but from refusing to build anything that could only survive if someone else failed. That realization was quieter than victory and far more permanent. I agreed to meet them because silence had already done its work. Austin was my choice, not because it was convenient, but because it belonged to none of us. Neutral ground mattered. Familiar places have a way of pulling people back into old roles, and I was not willing to step into mine again. They were already seated when I arrived. My parents sat side by side, hands folded too neatly on the table. Madison was across from them, scrolling on her phone until she noticed me. She looked irritated rather than relieved, as if my presence were a concession she had not wanted to make. My mother stood first. "Elena," she said, reaching for a hug that stopped short when I didn't move forward. The gesture collapsed into an awkward smile. "Thank you for coming." I took my seat and placed my bag beside the chair. "Let's talk," I said calmly. "That's why I'm here." The server arrived with menus. My father ordered drinks for the table out of habit, then caught himself and looked at me, uncertain. I nodded once. He ordered water instead. No one spoke for a moment. The clink of silverware and the low murmur of other conversations filled the space. Finally, my mother leaned forward. "We've been worried," she said. "You disappeared. You didn't answer calls. We didn't know where you were." "You knew I was alive," I replied. "That seemed to be enough." Madison scoffed. "This is exactly what I meant," she said. "You turn everything into a performance. You could have just said you were upset." I met her gaze without flinching. "I wasn't upset. I was done." My father cleared his throat. "We never meant to hurt you," he said. "It was an oversight. A terrible one, but still an oversight." That was my opening. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single folder. No theatrics, no buildup. I slid it across the table toward them. "I asked the travel agency for a record," I said, not because I wanted to argue, but because I needed to understand. My mother opened the folder first. Her eyes moved across the page, then back again, slower this time. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Madison stiffened. "What is that?" she asked sharply. My father leaned in, reading over my mother's shoulder. His face drained of color. The email was printed clearly, the timestamp impossible to ignore. Madison's name sat at the top of the request. "Please remove Elena Moore from the flight and hotel booking. She won't be attending." The date was weeks before the wedding. My mother looked up at Madison, confusion turning to something heavier. "You said we forgot," she whispered. Madison's jaw tightened. "I didn't think it mattered," she snapped. "She's always busy. I assumed she'd understand." "You told us there was no room," my father said quietly. "You said everything was full." Madison crossed her arms. "It was my wedding. I didn't want distractions." I let the words hang in the air. "A distraction," I repeated. "That's what I was." Madison looked at me then, really looked at me, and something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe, or resentment, sharpened by years of comparison. "You always make people feel small," she said. "You walk into a room and suddenly everything revolves around you. I just wanted one day." My mother covered her mouth. My father stared at the table, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't take your day," I said evenly. "You took my place." The silence that followed was different from any we had known before. It was not defensive or confused. It was honest. "I didn't come here for an apology," I continued. "I came to tell you what this changed for me." They waited. "I finally stopped wondering what I did wrong," I said. "I stopped trying to earn space that should never have been conditional. What happened didn't break me. It clarified everything." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Elena," she began. I held up a hand, not harshly, but firmly. "This is where the boundary is," I said. "You can be part of my life if you choose to see me as a whole person, not a backup plan or a support system you only notice when something goes wrong." I looked at Madison. "And you don't get to decide when I matter." My father nodded slowly. "We failed you," he said. "Yes," I replied. "You did." I stood, picked up my bag, and paused. "This conversation freed me," I said, my voice steady. "That's all I wanted you to know." As I walked out into the warm Austin evening, the air felt lighter against my skin. Not because they understood everything, but because I no longer needed them to. The truth had done its work, and so had I. The ballroom in Dallas was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in tone. Polished floors, muted lighting, and rows of investors who had learned how to hide emotion behind measured applause. I stood backstage with my notes untouched, listening to the low murmur of conversations that could shift markets before lunch. This was not my first conference, but it was the first time I had nothing to prove. Silvercore's CEO leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "They're presenting right before you," he said, nodding toward the stage. "Victor Hale's team." I nodded once. I already knew. When Victor stepped into the spotlight, he wore the confidence of someone who believed momentum alone could carry him. His slides were elegant, full of sharp graphs and aggressive timelines. He spoke about scale, speed, and domination, promising efficiencies that sounded irresistible if you did not understand what held supply chains together when pressure arrived. I watched carefully, not with anxiety, but with focus. The questions came quickly. One investor asked about contingency sourcing. Another pressed on regulatory exposure. Victor answered smoothly, deflecting specifics, leaning on projections that looked solid but lacked weight. Applause followed, polite and controlled. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium and let the room settle before speaking. I did not open with vision or ambition. I opened with data, real data. I showed live dashboards tied to actual performance, not forecasts. I spoke about systems built to absorb shock rather than deny it. I explained how Silvercore's network had already weathered disruptions that had broken competitors who chased speed without structure. A hand rose in the front row. "How are your margins holding under that model?" I smiled. "They are improving," I said, and advanced the slide. Because stability reduces cost in ways growth alone never will. The room shifted. Another investor leaned forward. "Your numbers don't match what we were shown earlier." "They shouldn't," I replied evenly. "Those numbers assume compliance without capacity. Ours account for reality." I did not mention Victor's name. I did not need to. The contrast spoke for itself. By the time I finished, the questions were no longer polite. They were urgent. Phones were lifted. Notes were taken. Somewhere behind me, I sensed movement. The subtle recalibration that happens when confidence changes hands. When I stepped off the stage, Silvercore's board members were already standing. The announcement came less than an hour later. I was appointed Vice President of International Operations, effective immediately. The stock reacted before I had time to process the words, climbing fast enough to draw a ripple of attention across the room. Applause broke out again, this time unrestrained. As I accepted congratulations, my gaze drifted toward the back of the hall. My parents sat together, hands clasped, their expressions unreadable. Madison sat beside them, quiet, her eyes fixed on the stage. They were not smiling. They were not embarrassed. They were witnessing something they had never expected to see. Not success, independence. Later, in a quiet side room, I was handed the contract. The paper was thick, the pen heavier than it needed to be. I paused for a moment before signing, not out of hesitation, but reflection. A year earlier, my name had been removed from a list without a second thought. Now it was being written into something that could not be erased. As the ink dried, I felt no rush of triumph. What I felt was alignment. The sense that every decision, every boundary, every step taken without permission had led exactly here. That night, back in my hotel room, I stood by the window and looked out at the Dallas skyline. Light stretched into the distance, steady and unbothered. I thought about how quietly this journey had begun, how little noise it had made at first, and how powerful silence could be when used with intention. I had not won by outshouting anyone. I had won by building something that did not require approval to exist. Thank you for listening to this story. If you stayed with me from beginning to end, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories like this.